Good evening from New York. This is Thursday, January 20th, 656 days until the 2012 presidential election. Confronted with the reality that her party's cuts to insurance guaranteed for transplant patients put 98 Arizonans at risk, 2 of whom have already died. Governor Jan Brewer of Arizona has now offered a solution that will leave them at that risk until July and then pay for their transplant insurance by denying other medical coverage to 285,000 more people in her state. Our fifth story, it's the death panel somehow made worse. And for Republicans nationally, like Michelle Bachmann, it may be a template. Arizona first. The governor's plan for those the Republican legislature cut off from transplant insurance: create an uncompensated care pool of $151 million, which would be paid for in part by cutting 280,000, mostly childless adults from the state Medicaid rolls, according to the governor's budget summary. Also by cutting 5,200 more seriously mentally ill individuals from Medicaid, according to Bloomberg News. The problem, other than denying coverage to the seriously mentally ill in Arizona, and other than kicking another few 100,000 people off Medicare, is that those individuals would then fall into the new uncompensated pool, as explained by Arizona State Representative Anna Tovar through her spokeswoman, quoting, all those people will be making use of that fund, which drains that fund. So then, quote, the likelihood of receiving transplants is very low. Governor Brewer's proposal also is for fiscal years 2012 and 2013, meaning that until July of this year, the governor doesn't even have a bad idea on how to cover these life and death cases. And even then, the state would have to get a waiver from a federal law that prohibits states from changing Medicaid eligibility for 2 years. Let's turn first to the state Senate Minority Leader in Arizona, David Shapira. Thank you for your time tonight, sir.
Thanks for having me, Keith.
What is your opinion of this proposal by the governor and whether it would or would not achieve this claimed goal of covering these life or death cases for the transplant patients?
The worst part about the story is it does not solve the problem. It does not pay for the transplants. And so, I appreciate my colleague, Representative Tovar, saying that, this might help, but it wouldn't really help enough. I actually talked to the budget chief of the governor today, and this plan does nothing for these transplant patients. And here's the reason. Because what they're going to do is they're going to kick 280,000 people off of access, off of our state's Medicaid program. These are lots of people that are going to still be out there seeking medical services, and they're not going to be able to pay their doctors. And so what's going to happen is that we're going to create this $150 million pool, which, by the way, we can only do with approval from the federal government, which I don't believe they're going to give us, and approval from our state's voters. And then doctors who maybe give transplants are going to go seek to get compensated out of this fund, which they will only get compensated to the tune of pennies on the dollar. So what will happen is doctors just aren't going to do these transplants. They're still going to say back to the patients, you've got to pay for it, and if you can't pay for it, we're not going to perform the procedure.
As I understood it, you were gaining some momentum, and there were even some Republicans in the legislature who were appalled at the fact that, for want of $1,400,000, that 98 lives were imminently at risk in your state because of the cancellation of this access coverage for these transplant people. What happened to that? What chance do you have legislatively of overturning the governor's decision without going into this Rube Goldberg solution that isn't even a solution?
I would love to say we'd have a great chance, but I don't know that that's true, and unfortunately it's again because of the governor. I've actually introduced a bill, Senate Bill 1001, and Representative Tovar has introduced a companion bill in the House to try and restore the transplant coverage. I've gone and talked to the appropriations chairman, who is the chair of the committee this bill's assigned to, and asked, can we get a hearing for this bill, and can we do it urgently, because there are still 96 people counting on us to restore this funding. And my response from that person was that the governor has told him, Senator Biggs, the chair of that committee, the governor has told him not to hear the bill. So the governor does not want this transplant funding restored, and no matter what kind of solutions we can come up with, she is basically so against it that she's actually telling the legislature not to hear the bill.
Your state, like most, obviously has budget issues, and we don't have to get into the weeds of the particular budget issues, but the governor's still making choices about where there is money to spend. It's not like the pockets are absolutely empty, and she's still pushing for tax cuts for corporations as opposed to $1 million to potentially save 96 lives.
Yeah, here's the saddest part about this story, Keith. The saddest part is this is a very small amount of money relative to our overall state budget. And it's actually $1.2 million, and then we get a $3 million match from the federal government, which we've now lost because we've cut that money. If we restore that $1.2 million and get the $3 million match, we could potentially save these 96 people's lives. There are so many different options out there of things that we could do, and the governor is unwilling to consider any of those things, regardless of the point that this could actually potentially save lives.
Last point, did she propose this solution and attach it to the issue of the transplants to cover the fact that she just had a good opportunity here to cut another, 250,000 people's state Medicaid to some significant degree?
Keith, sadly, I think this was the plan all along. All along, the governor has been holding on to this transplant issue so that when the state seeks the waiver for Medicaid, we could say, well, you've got to give us this waiver, because if you don't, then we are not going to be able to restore this transplant money. The sad part is, if that was the trade-off, you would think that she would be directly restoring this money as a process of asking for this waiver, and she's not. She's creating this uncompensated care fund, which doesn't even solve the problem. So she's using literally 96 people's lives as a political bargaining chip. And all I ask, and the Senate Democrats are asking, is for the governor and the leadership at the Capitol to set partisanship aside, set politics aside, take into account the real human capital that we're talking about here, and let's just stop playing politics and deal with this issue.
Apparently you had 12 days of that in Arizona, and that was this year's allocation, unfortunately, of putting politics aside and people first. Arizona State Senator David Shapiro, thanks for your time tonight, Senator.
Thank you, sir.
To the likely macro version of this, if Republicans got their wish on a national scale, from Congresswoman Michelle Bachmann of Minnesota, when it was suggested that Democrats wanted the GOP to offer its so-called health care reform replacement.
We'll be happy to. We have all sorts of plans. We've already been signing up on bills yesterday that we're going to be introducing to replace Obamacare, and we're all too happy to come up with our free market solutions.
Free market solutions. Congresswoman Bachmann confessed that free market solutions would extend even to this.
Will you allow pre-existing conditions under a new plan, at which point it's unveiled to the American people, that pre-existing conditions will be included in that?
Well, I think, again, this is an issue for the marketplace that the marketplace has dealt with in the past, and that they can. Again, the real issue on pre-existing conditions deals with people who could go into a high-risk pool. We already have a number of states that do that.
And it's worked like a charm. According to the Department of Health and Human Services, there are about 50 million Americans with a pre-existing condition based on the definition used by those high-risk pools. When using the guidelines established by the marketplace, the insurance companies, there are 129 million Americans with a pre-existing condition and therefore subject to denial. Never mind those tawdry little numbers. Ms. Bachmann is eager to press her point for the next election cycle.
This is not symbolic. This is why we were sent here, and we will not stop until we repeal a president and put a president in the position of the White House who will repeal this bill, until we repeal the current Senate, put in a Senate that will listen to the American people.
You keep using that word. I do not think it means what you think it means. Besides which, in Tuesday's Washington Post ABC News poll, only 18% of Americans still support full repeal. As for the GOP backslapping over its repeal of health care reform, there was Congressman Joe Uli Wilson tweeting in all caps yesterday, quote, "We just repealed Obamacare. All you need to know about substance and message and IQs less than 50. Let's turn to the senior political editor of the Huffington Post, MSNBC political analyst Howard Feynman. Howard, good evening.
Hi, Keith.
This was obviously one of those moments longed for by those congressional Republicans, as we could tell, especially from Ms. Bachmann's kind of repeal Tourette's right there. The day after the big repeal, how's the repeal roadshow going?
Well, I don't think it's going that well. You cited the poll numbers in the new AP poll. And I think there's been some loss of steam in the repeal movement as it runs into reality. And it runs into politics, because the fact is, as even the Fox News interviewer indicated, the administration has managed to get across the point, and the Democrats have managed to get across the point, that the reform bill does say that all people with pre-existing conditions are entitled to insurance coverage. That's a reform that most of the American people understand and I think basically like. Ditto with allowing kids up to the age of 26 to be covered by their parents' plans. People also understand that for the near poor, there will be other subsidies allowing them coverage, which I think a lot of people support. And the administration has gotten across the notion that there are real cuts that would save money, and that Medicare and Medicaid, two of the most problematic programs in all of the federal government are subject to reforms that might help them both. So all of that's gotten across, and even though there's still some support for the overall idea of repeal, these individual pieces have gotten through to the American people and made the situation a lot more complicated politically for the Republicans.
So how low does the support for the all-out repeal have to drop before the Republicans change the subject, or are they going to try to ride this for 2 years and just futz around with, you know, big symbolic victories that don't mean anything in the real world?
No, I don't think they're going to. And talking to both Republicans in both the House and the Senate, they're aware that they don't want to make the mistake that they think the president made and that they campaigned on during the last election. They said he spent too much time talking about health care. He took a year on health care and ignored jobs. Now, the president of the State of the Union, as I understand it, is going to, among other things, do a kind of Sputnik 2 thing where he talks about technology and education and innovation in the long haul to compete with the Chinese economically. He's going to move on. And the Republicans, I think some of them, at least the leadership knows, that it will be making a mistake if it spends the next year on health care, and I don't think they're planning to do it.
Thus, are Democrats, particularly House Democrats, looking better by default? I mean, we saw what happened when this bill went out there and the Democrats came back with hard-hitting facts and quick, terse rebuttals of the Republican points on this, where they just suddenly looked like, well, these are actual politicians with some backbone to them. I mean, is that because they've actually seen something, or because the thing is popular, therefore they can support it, or has it just been made easy for them because the Republicans seem to be, you know, beating the proverbial dead horse?
Well, the thing is that, as you've pointed out, and as others have pointed out, the Republicans haven't yet come with any kind of thoroughgoing replacement. They've got all kinds of pieces out there, some of which make sense, but they hadn't bothered to put them together into a whole if they were serious about selling it. So a lot of people in the middle who are just sort of looking as citizens at this don't take the Republicans seriously, number one. And number two, the Republicans' effort to, quote, defund it, which they may try next through the budget process to defund health care reform, is impractical. If you look at it carefully, for technical reasons I won't bore you with, it's pretty much impossible to do it. So they're left with nothing. They're left with one symbolic vote with no real change in the program and looking like they're opponents rather than supporters of anything. And their opposition makes the Democrats look noble even in defense.
And at least Congressman Wilson got to send a tweet. Howard Fineman, the senior political editor of the Huffington Post. As always, great thanks, Howard.
Thank you, Keith.